There comes a moment in every man's life when the applause stops, the friends disappear, and the crowd grows silent. It's the moment when you stand face to face with your reality, stripped of titles, positions, and human validation. It's in that place of isolation that you truly discover who sustains you. When a man has no one but God, he steps into the deepest level of divine partnership. It's there in the wilderness of solitude that God reveals himself not as a distant deity, but as an ever-present help. When people walk away, when doors close, and when life seems to silence your voice, God becomes your anchor, your provider, your defender. Sometimes God will remove every human support so that you can finally learn to lean fully on him, not as a last resort, but as your first foundation. When a man finds himself in a place of isolation, separated from the noise, detached from the familiar, and stripped of the comforts that once defined his sense of belonging, he often perceives it as abandonment or rejection. Yet, what seems like isolation in the natural is, in truth, a divine setup in the spiritual. God will often orchestrate seasons in a person's life where the crowd disperses, voices grow silent, and companionship fades, not as punishment, but as preparation. When God wants to reveal himself in a deeper way, he removes the distractions that compete for your attention. He isolates you not to break you, but to build you. In the stillness of solitude, the man who once relied on the opinions, affirmations, and presence of others begins to hear a new sound, the voice of God whispering purpose, direction, and identity into his spirit. Isolation becomes the sacred ground where revelation is born. It is the divine classroom where the soul learns. That intimacy with God cannot be developed in the noise of public affirmation, but in the quiet chambers of divine communion. When God calls you to himself, he doesn't always do it through abundance or visibility. Many times he calls you through the pathway of loneliness, misunderstanding, and separation. You may not understand why certain people had to leave, why certain opportunities closed, or why your circle grew smaller. But what you fail to see in the moment is that divine subtraction often precedes supernatural multiplication. God takes away what you cling to so that he can replace it with something eternal. In isolation, he strips away false securities and shallow attachments, teaching you to depend not on man's approval, but on his divine presence. When a man has no one but God, he begins to see that what he thought was rejection was really redirection. He realizes that God never removes something without intending to replace it with himself. It is in this sacred solitude that spiritual maturity takes root. When you have no one to call, no one to lean on, and no one to validate your journey, you start recognizing that the approval you once sought from men cannot sustain your destiny. Isolation reveals motives, purifies desires, and sanctifies intentions. God isolates to elevate, but before elevation comes transformation. He pulls you away to prepare you for what you cannot yet see. You begin to discover that intimacy with God is not built through religious routine, but through relationship forged in the furnace of loneliness. The wilderness becomes the womb of divine encounters. It is in that barren place that your faith ceases to be theoretical and becomes experiential. Moses met God not in Pharaoh's palace, but on the backside of the desert. Elijah heard God's voice not in the fire or the wind, but in the still small whisper on the mountain. David was anointed not in the court of Saul, but while tending sheep in solitude. Even Jesus withdrew to lonely places to pray, to recharge, and to hear the Father clearly. Isolation is not evidence of God's absence, but proof of his preparation. When you are alone, it is not that God has abandoned you. It is that he has finally removed every competing voice so you can hear him without interference. In the silence, you begin to discern his tone, his rhythm, his leading. In the secret place, God begins to redefine you. He reminds you that your identity is not rooted in what people say, but in who he says you are. In moments of isolation, he peels back every false layer and exposes the authentic self that he created before the foundation of the world. You begin to confront hidden fears, silent insecurities, and unresolved pain. that were buried beneath busyness and noise. Isolation forces you to see yourself through the lens of truth. It is uncomfortable because it strips away illusions, but it is also freeing because it awakens authenticity. When you are finally left with nothing but God, you find that He is more than enough. God uses isolation as a divine detox. The same way a body must cleanse itself of toxins to restore strength, the soul must be purged of attachments that drain its spiritual vitality. People, habits, and patterns that once provided comfort may suddenly feel distant or unnecessary. The conversations that once energized you may now feel empty. The pursuits that once consumed you lose their pull. It is because God is reconfiguring your internal compass. He is shifting your hunger from the external to the eternal. You begin to crave His presence more than platforms, His voice more than validation, His approval more than applause. Isolation, therefore, is not punishment. It is purification. In this sacred process, time seems slower and the silence can feel heavy. Yet in that stillness, something powerful happens. Divine intimacy is birthed. You begin to recognize the subtle presence of God in ways you never did before. You sense Him in the quiet mornings, in the simplicity of prayer, in the gentle conviction of the Spirit. What once seemed like emptiness becomes fullness. What once felt like loss becomes gain. You learn to walk with God as your companion, your counselor, and your confidant. You discover that intimacy with Him is not found in the crowd, but in the secret place of the heart. Isolation also separates imitation from authenticity. When a man has no one to impress, his true motives are revealed. You no longer pray to be seen, you pray to survive. You no longer serve to be applauded, you serve to obey. You no longer speak to be heard, you speak because truth burns within you. God uses this season to refine your purpose, align your heart, and strengthen your spirit. The man who emerges from divine isolation is no longer driven by ambition, but by assignment. He becomes anchored, grounded, and unshakable because his strength no longer depends on external support. In isolation, your hearing becomes sharper. You begin to discern divine whispers that were once drowned by the noise of life. You start to notice that every delay, every disappointment, and every detour had divine purpose. You begin to understand that the pruning was necessary for growth. Like a tree whose roots grow deeper when cut back, your spirit grows stronger when isolated. God teaches you the rhythm of dependence, how to move when He moves and rest when He rests. This is where your spiritual senses awaken, your discernment deepens, and your faith solidifies. The power of isolation lies in revelation. When you have no one else to turn to, you turn inward and upward. You start to hear God's heartbeat. You realize that He's not just your creator. He's your sustainer, your source, your friend. It's in these quiet encounters that your calling becomes clearer. God begins to download blueprints, visions, and ideas that can only be received in stillness. He begins to reveal your next season, not through noise, but through knowing. You begin to understand that your destiny cannot be sustained by public applause, but by private communion. Isolation births authority. The man who has been alone with God carries a presence that cannot be manufactured. There is a depth in his voice, a weight in his words, and a peace in his posture. He no longer needs to prove himself because he has already been approved in the secret place. When he speaks, heavens respond because he carries divine backing. That's why God isolates you before He elevates you. Public power must be rooted in private intimacy. Without isolation, you would confuse visibility with value. God keeps you hidden until you are ready to handle the weight of what He wants to release through you. As you walk through the valley of isolation, you begin to understand that solitude is not emptiness, it's sacred space. It's where your tears become prayers, your pain becomes prophecy, and your silence becomes strength. You start to embrace the stillness not as loneliness, but as divine alignment. Every disappointment becomes a doorway to deeper dependence. Every closed door becomes an opportunity for divine revelation. God meets you there, in the in-between, in the unseen, in the unfamiliar. The man who has been isolated by God is not the same man who entered that season. He emerges with vision, with authority, with conviction. His faith is no longer shallow, but tested. His trust is no longer conditional, but complete. He carries a new understanding of who God is, not as a distant being, but as an intimate friend who never leaves nor forsakes. He walks with quiet confidence, knowing that everything he needs flows from the one who called him into the secret place. And though isolation may have been painful, it becomes the most transformative experience of his life, for it was there that he learned the true meaning of divine intimacy. Divine strength does not emerge in comfort, applause, or the validation of others. It is born in the quiet crucible of struggle, in the unseen battles of the soul where no one else is watching. When a man is reduced to nothing but his faith, when every human source of support has vanished, that is where divine strength begins to manifest. It is the power that arises when your natural ability runs out and the supernatural must take over. Human weakness becomes the soil in which divine power takes root. When you can no longer carry yourself, when your plans crumble, and when your energy fades, God steps in and reveals that his strength was never meant to be an addition to yours. It was always meant to be the source. The power of God is not displayed through perfection, but through dependence. When a man is weak in himself, he becomes strong in God, for it is through surrender that true strength is revealed. The human tendency is to hide weakness, to mask vulnerability, to present an image of control and confidence, but God cannot fill what is already full. He cannot strengthen what refuses to admit its own frailty. When you finally reach the end of yourself, when you confess that you cannot do it on your own, that is when divine strength rushes in like a mighty flood. It is not a strength that comes from striving or self-effort. It comes from yielding. The Apostle Paul said, "When I am weak, then I am strong," because he understood that divine power is perfected in human limitation. The areas where you feel most inadequate become the very places God chooses to demonstrate his sufficiency. When God wants to make a man strong, he does not place him in comfort. He places him in contradiction. He allows him to face circumstances that strip away every illusion of control. He lets him walk through fires that no human strategy can extinguish. He lets the storms rage until the man learns that his survival does not depend on his strength, but on God's. Divine strength is not developed in the absence of adversity, but in the endurance of it. You learn to stand not because life is easy, but because grace sustains you. The more you rely on him, the stronger you become, not in flesh, but in spirit. This strength cannot be seen outwardly at first. It is not the kind that flexes muscles or boasts accomplishments. It is quiet, steady, unbreakable. It is the strength that allows a man to keep believing when there's no visible reason to. It's what gives him the courage to pray even when the heavens feel silent. It's what keeps him walking forward when the path ahead is uncertain. Divine strength is not loud. It is consistent. It does not need validation because it is anchored in revelation. It is the strength that whispers, "You can endure," when everything around you says, "Give up." Every great man of faith had to come to this place. Abraham was promised nations, yet had to wait decades with an aging body. Joseph was given a dream, yet spent years in prison before he saw fulfillment. Job lost everything, yet still said, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust him." David was anointed as king, but had to hide in caves before he could wear the crown. Each of them discovered that divine strength is not measured by what you can control, but by what you can survive. It is the ability to remain faithful when nothing makes sense, to keep your posture of worship when pain fills your heart, and to trust that God's hand is still on you, even when you cannot trace his movement. When a man learns to lean into divine strength, he stops fighting battles in his own power. He begins to fight from a posture of surrender, knowing that victory belongs to the Lord. He realizes that his assignment is not to fix everything, but to remain faithful through everything. In this place, faith becomes his weapon, worship becomes his warfare, and prayer becomes his source of renewal. He understands that every battle is not meant to destroy him, but to develop him. The pressure he feels is not punishment, it is preparation. The trials that once made him tremble now train him to trust. Divine strength refines your focus. It teaches you to see beyond what's visible, to trust beyond what's tangible. You begin to walk by faith and not by sight. You no longer depend on what you feel, because feelings fluctuate, but God's truth remains constant. You start to operate from a deeper awareness that God's power is made perfect precisely when you are at your weakest. The struggles that once broke you now build you. The pain that once silenced you now propels you. You learn to say, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, not as a slogan, but as a revelation birthed in the trenches of life. This divine strength transforms your mindset. It teaches you that weakness is not something to fear, but something to surrender. The world teaches that strength is independence, but heaven teaches that strength is dependence, complete dependence on God. Divine strength allows you to stand when the world expects you to fall. It gives you resilience in rejection, courage in confusion, and peace in pressure. You start to realize that your breaking point is God's building point. When you have nothing left, that's when God has room to work. He takes your exhaustion and exchanges it for endurance. He takes your frustration and replaces it with faith. He takes your tears and turns them into testimony. In the process, your spiritual muscles begin to develop. Every prayer in pain becomes a spiritual rep. Every moment of endurance becomes a layer of unseen power. Over time, your perspective shifts. You no longer see weakness as failure, but as an invitation for grace. You begin to embrace the seasons that stretch you because you know they are shaping you into who God designed you to be. Divine strength does not make life easier, but it makes you unshakable within it. You stop asking, why me, and start saying, use me. You understand that strength is not the absence of struggle, but the presence of God in the midst of it. The beauty of divine strength is that it flows not from striving, but from abiding. When you stay connected to God, his power naturally flows through you. Like a branch drawing life from the vine, your strength is sustained by connection, not by effort. You stop living from exhaustion and start living from overflow. You start performing for acceptance and start operating from identity. You begin to realize that God's strength is not something you summon in crisis. It is something you carry in covenant. It is the daily awareness that you are never alone, that every step you take is empowered by divine grace. As divine strength grows in you, so does your peace. The battles that once terrified you no longer shake you because you've seen God's faithfulness too many times to doubt him now. You start walking with quiet authority. You speak with conviction, not because of what you've read, but because of what you've lived. You understand that real power is not about dominating others, but mastering yourself. Divine strength gives you the ability to stay calm in chaos, to forgive when wronged, and to remain patient in waiting. It disciplines your emotions and sharpens your discernment. It gives you endurance to withstand storms that would have crushed you in earlier seasons. Sometimes divine strength doesn't look like a miracle. It looks like you showing up one more day. It looks like you praying again, even after nothing changed. It looks like you forgiving again, even when it still hurts. It looks like you believing again, even when the evidence says otherwise. It's not dramatic, but it's powerful. It's not flashy, but it's unbreakable. It's what keeps you moving forward when logic tells you to stop. Divine strength is God living through you, enabling you to rise above what would normally destroy you. You begin to realize that divine strength is not something you receive once. It's something you cultivate daily. Every time you choose faith over fear, you strengthen it. Every time you choose gratitude over grumbling, you feed it. Every time you choose to trust God instead of yourself, you deepen it. Divine strength is a process of continual exchange. Your weakness for his power, your will for his purpose, your chaos for his peace. The more you surrender, the stronger you become. There are moments when God will allow situations specifically designed to show you how strong his grace is within you. He'll put you in circumstances that seem impossible so that when you come out on the other side, you'll know it was not by might nor by power, but by his spirit. These experiences are not random. They are intentional. They shape your testimony and increase your capacity to carry his glory. You emerge from them not just stronger, but wiser, not just tougher, but more tender toward the things of God. You develop compassion for others because you know what it feels like to depend on grace. Divine strength doesn't always change your situation immediately. It changes you in the midst of it. It refines your patience, expands your endurance, and deepens your faith. It anchors you so deeply in God that circumstances lose their power to control you. You start living with a holy resilience, a divine confidence that nothing can separate you from his love. You walk with the awareness that you are empowered by something greater than yourself. It is no longer you who lives, but Christ living in you, expressing his strength through your surrendered life. When God becomes your only source, lack becomes impossible. This truth is not understood in comfort, but in seasons of complete dependency, where every earthly supply seems to have run dry. It is when every door closes, when people you once relied on withdraw, when your resources fail, and when the strength of your own hands no longer produces results, that God reveals himself as Jehovah Jireh, the one who provides. When a man reaches the end of his ability, he encounters the beginning of divine sufficiency. In that moment, he learns that God is not one of many sources. He is the source. Everything else is a channel. People, jobs, and opportunities are instruments God uses, but the flow originates from him alone. When this revelation takes root in your spirit, fear loses its grip because you realize that as long as you have God, you will never truly lack. God has a way of stripping away every false dependency so that he alone can be magnified as your provider. He allows the brook to dry up, not because he has forgotten you, but because he wants to shift your focus from the brook to the one who made it flow. Like Elijah by the brook Cherith, you may find that what once sustained you no longer does. The job that once paid your bills may disappear. The people who once helped you may walk away, and the systems you once trusted may crumble. But in those moments of apparent lack, heaven begins to move. Divine provision does not depend on visible supply. It depends on invisible sovereignty. When you belong to God, he becomes obligated to sustain you according to his covenant. He will feed you through unexpected sources, bless you through unlikely vessels, and open doors that men cannot shut. When you truly make God your source, your perspective on lack changes. You stop measuring provision by what you have and start measuring it by who you have. You understand that the same God who rained manna from heaven and brought water from a rock is still faithful to meet your needs today. Your confidence shifts from bank accounts to divine accounts, from wages to promises. You realize that your sustenance is not limited to natural means because you serve a supernatural God. When others panic, you remain at peace because you know that your supply is not tied to economic systems, but to divine order. God's provision transcends circumstances. It is not seasonal. It is covenantal. When God becomes your only source, contentment begins to grow within you. You stop striving for more and start resting in his sufficiency. You learn that lack is not always the absence of resources. Sometimes it is the absence of trust. God allows you to walk through seasons of scarcity to teach you that he alone can satisfy. He wants to prove to you that even when nothing else works, his word still stands. In those times, faith becomes your currency, obedience your strategy, and gratitude your key. You realize that every time you trust him, heaven responds. Every act of faith invites divine supply. Every moment of surrender unlocks supernatural provision. When you depend solely on God, you develop spiritual eyesight. You begin to perceive opportunities where others see obstacles. God gives you ideas, strategies, and divine insights that turn impossibility into provision. He may not always send you money, but he will send you wisdom. He may not drop resources from the sky, but he will open doors that lead to overflow. His provision is not limited to physical needs. It extends to emotional peace, spiritual strength, and mental clarity. When he becomes your only source, you realize that true wealth is not in what you possess, but in who possesses you. You stop living in anxiety over what you lack and start walking in gratitude for what you already have, knowing that more will always come when needed. God often tests the heart before he releases abundance. He will allow seasons that expose whether your trust lies in him or in the systems of the world. He will sometimes let the well run dry so that you learn that he is the fountain that never runs out. When God is your source, your dependency becomes your strength. You learn that the kingdom operates on a different economy. The more you give, the more he provides. You begin to experience a divine cycle of supply where obedience becomes the key to overflow. As you release what's in your hand, he releases what's in his. When your heart is anchored in his faithfulness, you stop hoarding out of fear and start giving out of faith, because you know that heaven never allows a giver to go empty. When you walk with God as your provider, you realize that his timing is perfect. He may not come when you want, but he always comes when you need him most. He allows delays to stretch your faith, not to destroy your hope. Every delay is divine preparation for greater manifestation. You begin to see that lack is not always a curse. Sometimes it is a divine classroom where you learn stewardship, gratitude, and trust. God uses temporary lack to prepare you for permanent abundance. The man who trusts God as his only source walks with quiet confidence even in uncertain times, because he knows his supply is secured in the eternal. When God becomes your only source, your priorities shift. You stop chasing resources and start pursuing the one who owns them. You realize that provision is not something you chase, it's something that follows obedience. When your life aligns with his will, resources begin to find you, opportunities begin to seek you out, favor begins to track your steps. This is the mystery of divine provision. The more you focus on God, the less you have to worry about supply. You live in a state of divine flow where your needs are met as you walk in purpose. The world calls it luck, but heaven calls it alignment. You begin to understand that true abundance is not just having more than enough, it is having exactly what you need when you need it. God provides with precision. He knows when to release, how much to release, and through whom to release it. He orchestrates resources like a master conductor, ensuring that every note of your life plays in harmony with his divine plan. When he is your source, you never have to manipulate or compromise to receive. You simply stay faithful, and the provision meets you in your assignment. The same God who sent ravens to feed Elijah and multiplied oil for the widow still moves with the same power today. The greatest proof that God is your source is peace. When you truly trust him, anxiety loses power. You no longer panic over delays because you know that God is never late. He's strategic. You stop comparing your journey with others because you understand that your supply is customized. You learn to rest in the rhythm of grace, trusting that everything you need will come at the right time. Even when you have little, you feel full. Even when doors close, you sense divine redirection. Even when others see famine, you see faithfulness. When a man lives from the revelation that God is his only source, Generosity flows naturally. He understands that he is not an owner, but a steward. Everything he has belongs to God, and everything God gives is meant to flow through him. He becomes a vessel of blessing because he knows that channels never run dry. The more he gives, the more God replenishes. This cycle of divine provision keeps him in perpetual abundance, not always in material wealth, but in spiritual sufficiency, emotional peace, and unshakable faith. God's provision is often hidden in obedience. When he asks you to move, give, or trust, he is setting you up for supply. Every instruction is connected to a manifestation. The widow at Zarephath had to give her last meal before she saw the oil multiply. Peter had to cast his net one more time before it overflowed with fish. Abraham had to offer Isaac before God revealed the ram in the thicket. Each act of obedience unlocked a dimension of divine provision. When you obey God completely, lack cannot survive in your atmosphere. Heaven always responds to faith expressed through obedience. As you mature in your walk with God, you begin to understand that provision is not random. It is relational. It flows through intimacy with him. The closer you walk with God, the more effortlessly provision flows. It is not about striving, it's about staying connected. He supplies not because of what you do, but because of who you belong to. When you live in covenant relationship, you carry divine assurance that no matter what happens around you, you will be sustained. You may go through valleys, but you will never be forsaken. You may face famine, but you will always find favor. You may lose temporary support, but you will never lose divine supply. When God becomes your only source, you stop living in survival mode and start living in supernatural flow. You no longer operate from scarcity, but from sufficiency. You begin to expect miracles, not as rare occurrences, but as natural expressions of a faithful God. You stop asking, how will it happen? And start declaring God will make it happen. Learn that divine provision is not just about meeting needs. It's about revealing the nature of a father who delights in taking care of his children. You walk in confidence, not because you have everything, but because you know the one who owns everything.